Hi, I'm Gordon Raquel from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com. And also follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this is made possible by our sponsors, OWC. Go to OWC Digital so that they can help you with your filmmaking needs. This week, I'm joined by Elle Schneider, the cinematographer and director of The Food That Built America, the DP of That Guy, Dick Miller, and 18 and a Half, which is coming out soon. That's just to name a few. Welcome to the show, Elle.
Thanks for having me.
Well, one of my first questions is, one of the bios that I found of you says that some of your biggest influences are Roger Corman, David Lean, Fritz Lang, and James Cameron.
Yes.
What is the through line for these guys?
Um, I think there's a pretty big through line with all of the filmmakers that influence me. And, usually when I write out a bio and include my influences, it's really hard to narrow it down to a select few people. And I always kind of switch out who those people are from time to time. I also love Robert Wise and, Robert Wise, Roger Corman, Fritz Lang, James Cameron certainly all have sci-fi in common. But for me, it's more than sci-fi as a specific genre, but it's that a lot of filmmakers that work in that genre are really pushing boundaries, both visually and technically. And I really respect people that try to come up with new ways of using existing technology or imagery or the language of cinema to create new and unusual films. Obviously, Fritz Lang is known for Metropolis, but he also made this film called Women in the Moon, which was the first sort of depiction of weightlessness in space. And that film isn't as well known as Metropolis, but it's very interesting. And he's trying to push science fiction from a more kind of scientific approach with that, which I think is really interesting. But in general, I also love filmmakers that work in different genres because they really are just very dedicated to the specific story they're trying to tell. I think every filmmaker is different, but especially with things that I direct, I'm as a storyteller, I'm coming more from something has inspired me and I have a specific story I'm trying to tell. I'm generally never out there looking for the next story to tell. I might be looking for funding for the next story to tell. But, I have a list of 20 different projects that I would love to be doing. And I don't know if that's similar with other filmmakers, but I just come across things that really strike my fancy pretty frequently. And one of the other directors that I admire is Stanley Kubrick. And one of the reasons amongst many that I admire him is he had this obsessive research that he would do on many of his films, including the unrealized ones. When the Kubrick exhibit was out and about in the world a few years ago, one of the pieces of the exhibit was a bookshelf and card catalog for his Napoleon film. And seeing that in a museum, that was the first time that I was like, oh wow, other people are like weirdly as obsessively research oriented as I am with some of my projects. And it's sometimes just nice to know that there's other people out there who have made really cool stuff that are that anal retentive.
Well, I remember when that came to Toronto and it was at TIFF, and I remember seeing that bookcase, and I think they had some kind of table where he wrote it or whatever he's in the process of writing. What is it about Roger Corman? Because I've also noticed you've worked on several projects about Roger Corman.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for many filmmakers. There's sort of this, so in order to feel like I'm a real filmmaker, I must shoot a project on film. For me, it's sort of in order to be a real filmmaker, you must have worked on a project with Roger Corman. But I mean, really, Roger's inspirational to me in a number of ways. First of all, he was one of the earliest hirers of women directors. in the late 60s, which I think is something that is worthy of more exploration. But in general, you know, he came out and started making scrappy movies and really understood how to connect with an audience, even on these super low budget films that he was making. He tried all sorts of different genres. One thing that's also really fascinating is that, you know, he always had a plan to be a studio director. And at one point he actually did have multiple studio contracts, but they kind of fizzled for various reasons. But he was someone who was equally sort of obsessive to detail in the films that he wanted to make. And the films that happened to get made are sort of the ones that he made while in pursuit of the movies he was really trying to make, of which he was only ever able to really accomplish one. You know, he was someone who was willing to take a chance on new filmmakers and was willing to try new things. He was someone who was involved with trying to bring more Black actors into Hollywood movies and drive-in movies early on, even when he was told that was not marketable. And he just really kind of rebelled against the system in a way that was continuously profitable and successful and made films that people really enjoy watching. And I think that you can learn a lot of lessons from looking at his story and his collaborators.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, as a cinematographer, you know, you've got this new film coming out, 18 and a half. How do you like to approach the script and working with the director to get on the same page?
For 18 and a half, that was a really interesting and fun prep process, because the director, Dan, who I'd known a couple years socially at that point when he approached me about joining him on this project, he had a very specific look that he wanted to go for. He was looking at a lot of like Alan J. Pakula films and films from the 70s that had this particular grit, that were shot with a very sort of rigid film language. And so he sort of approached me with the challenge to, let's make this movie, let's make it look like the 1970s. And by doing that, we're not going to use a lot of handheld. We're not, you know, we're going to stick to dollies and tracks and zooms and lenses that have a funkier quality to them, so that we can really make the audience feel like we're in this time period. And that to me was a really great and fun challenge, because obviously most films these days are trying to look as clean as possible. I do a lot of work with various genres of period films. And one of the things that I always sort of run up against, which can be frustrating, is that we, as audience members, identify with previous eras based on our experience of the media from that time period. So, you know, if you are making a World War I movie, and it looks like it was a documentary shot yesterday, people are not going to respond well to that, you know, as opposed to if you look at something like Michael Haneke's The White Ribbon, which is the interwar period. You know, they made an effort with the cinematography for, first of all, obviously it's black and white, but to kind of mimic the style of photographs or the limited, you know, number of films that you would have seen at the time period. And that helps draw you into the story. And so I'm always trying to do that, but it's a really delicate balance, because you also have to make the film accessible to a current audience. You know, if you go too grainy, if you go too underexposed, if it's too kind of flat, it is not going to be something that people get emotionally excited about. And so that was a really cool task. And we kind of narrowed down, you know, we're going to shoot on this specific set of anamorphic lenses. We're going to use a spherical zoom of this specific kind in order to achieve some of these longer zoom shots. You know, we looked at very specific films like Klute, for example, and how they were doing unusual shots within that visual language. So that was really a pleasure to be able to work on with Dan, because also giving us those constraints allowed us to have some really creative aspects when we would pop out of that. So there is a handheld sequence towards the end, and there's a teensy bit of handheld in a dance scene earlier. And those kind of feel more vibrant because it is stepping outside of the language that we've established for the rest of the film. So it allows you to feel kind of more disjointed or more in the moment. I don't always get to do that kind of prep, but Dan is also a pretty experienced director, and so him, coming in with references and knowing what he wants specifically is always a really helpful part of the process when I'm working with a director.
What's interesting is there's something that you sort of touched on, and I've been talking to a couple of people about this, and it's, you're talking about how, like, you refer to it as, I guess, grit, or sort of like, like you'd had to work with film stocks and what have you. When I talked to a colleague of mine, we were discussing how Hollywood films are so clean now and so perfect that, if they make a mistake, they go reshoot, or they get a VFX team to clean it up. And it's almost like we've lost that humanity in the film. Like, I remember I was recently watching, I can't remember which film it was from the 70s, but there was an out of focus shot. Like, something happened on set and they just couldn't fix it, but it worked for the story, so let's go with it.
Yeah.
So when you approach films in something like this new film, if you're working on digital, how do you still bring in that humanity with it?
Well, what's really interesting is we discussed like how crazy we wanted to get with this, because something, first of all, I saw one of those shots where, a main talent went out of focus in a film I was watching last night.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's pretty common up through the mid 90s, because when you're measuring for talent on set and someone misses a mark, you don't know all the time, especially if there's some movement. You're just not going to know if they're in or out until, you've exposed the film. And sometimes you don't have the chance to go back in. There can be many reasons. This film that I was watching last night, the scene took place in a pretty big set piece. I can imagine that there wasn't the budget, or maybe the set itself had been destroyed in the process of shooting the scene. So it just was not going to be possible to go back and reshoot it. But also, I don't think people obviously wanted cleanliness and perfection, but there, because of the process and people understanding the process, I don't think there was this understanding at that time that things could be hyper perfect in that way. I think, there was an acceptable amount of wiggle room. And I think the difference that you see with that kind of stuff and digital films, maybe even trying to recreate it, is that you would just push ahead on a set that's shooting film because you don't know the difference. Whereas I feel like you can almost feel the panic a little bit behind the camera with digital, because everyone can see something like someone going out of focus on the monitor, and you'll see the creeping of the focus come in to correct it. There's sort of like a less confident vibe in trying to do that. So that aspect of recreating a film feel is very, I think, difficult, because there's just different like emotions behind the camera than you would have that would cause that to happen or not happen. One thing that Dan and I did talk about, which we sort of did, but not as overtly as you might see in an older film, is that from time to time, when you're missing a close-up in an older film, I mean, you'll see a punch in where they're like really cropping in significantly into a frame, and all of a sudden it goes from like a mild amount of grain to like Bigfoot level of grain. Because they just really needed another shot for the scene and they didn't have it. And, we discussed whether that might be part of the language or whether it was too much. And sort of ultimately we decided that it was too much, but there are definitely places where there are very long zooms that get extremely fuzzy towards the end. And that's just part of the aesthetic that we ended up going for. And I think it creates something, a little bit more unusual than, you know, what you're used to seeing. But it's also really hard, I mean, to keep watching period pieces and retro films that, you know, look like people walked off the set, you know, 5 minutes ago. And that to me takes me out of a film much more than watching an older film and there's a shot that kind of gets weird looking.
Yeah. Well, then you go, then you think about Kubrick to go back, and it's like, I'm gonna light the scene with candles, and let's go find
Yeah.
a bigger lens to make this work. Now, it sounds like all this is also a part of the tone of the piece,
Yeah.
right? So, like, how, when you're working with a director, do you get on the same page for tone and making sure that you give that feeling to the audience?
Well, 18 and a half is sort of a comedic Watergate era thriller. And it's weird to have a comedy thriller overlap, but it's very unusual film. And because of that, you know, the tone does shift a bit from tension to humor. And one thing, you know, that in embracing a sort of grittier look for some of the film, you know, it's not super bright and poppy in the way that it's lit. It takes place during winter time. So there's a little bit of harsh sunlight here, but it's not like a happy, harsh sunlight. And so a lot of it was just taking advantage of the locations that we had, which was a lot of browns and a lot of, you know, kind of dead trees and things like that to really keep the look and therefore the feel consistent. You know, it's embracing underexposure in a realistic way, you know, like not hyper lighting things to make them ultra flattering in a way that wouldn't make sense for the either the time period or the location that we were using. You know, that's always a thing, is like, you know, I think there's a lot of hyper commercial looking features these days, but it doesn't always suit the tone of the story. And so because we had this really good look that we were going for, we kind of played within that, which was nice. And then, of course, because best laid plans, we actually started shooting 18 and a half on March 4th of 2020. And we ended up halting production a week early because the pandemic had happened, and we were, I think, one of the two last features shooting in North America. We had gotten approval from the DGA to keep shooting because we were sort of in this small town in the woods, shooting at a motel and staying at the motel. So we were effectively already isolated. But you know, a lot of the team had to get back to LA and were worried whether there would still be groceries on the shelves or planes to fly on.
Yeah.
So we ended up
toilet paper.
Exactly. And so we ended up taking a 6-month pause in the middle of production, and came, you know, so we started shooting when the weather was like borderline miserable in March on Long Island, and then came back in early September when everything was beautiful and breezy. And that was interesting because we still had to match this winter vibe when it was like the height of Labor Day tourist season. So that was kind of a fun challenge too, but I think we pulled it off.
Now, what was it that made you want to make the series, The Food That Built America?
So I was invited to work on the first season of Food That Built America. I was a DP and second unit director on the first season. And from what I understand, the producers had seen a short Western horror that I had shot and directed for Panasonic the year before. And they were looking for someone who understood how to light and direct for period pieces, but at the same time. And it turns out that, you know, it's kind of a skill set that is not very common. So I was on the first season and I had a really great experience, and they asked me back for the second season. And so we shot that under COVID last year. I actually went immediately from wrapping 18 and a half up to Connecticut, where we were prepping for food. And it was a challenging shoot, because the way that that show is done is to do 2 units at the same time. And so you're dealing with, I think we had 133 names on the cast list last season. And then we had around 100 crew. So we're talking about like a huge number of people to keep safe during COVID, which the production company, I think, did a really amazing job at. And we were, I think, one of the earlier TV series like that to go back. And for me, I have a preference for genre material. That's what emotionally I'm drawn to. And a lot of the time, those are not contemporary stories that I'm interested in. So for me, I enjoy shooting period pieces, even if it is more drama focused, because it still kind of gives me some of the storytelling that I like. And in my experience, I don't get offered some of the other genres like sci-fi or horror as much as I would prefer to. For whatever reason, I'm often most offered comedy. So period pieces are a good way to kind of still be able to do the cool lighting and have a kind of more unique story that more suits who I am as a filmmaker. And I really enjoy working in TV. I enjoy the process of collaborating with the producers. I like taking a, 2 heads are better than one approach with notes. And I really respect the input of my crew. I don't know if I necessarily ascribe to an auteur theory for myself. Again, I have very specific stories that I like to tell, but film is a deeply collaborative medium. And even for someone as precise as Kubrick, he's making choices in the collaborators he's bringing in that have a major effect on the outcome of the work. And I, like to work with people who, are going to suggest good ideas or are going to notice things that I am not aware of. Shooting and directing at the same time is not necessarily my preference. I do it a lot because I do a lot of branded work also for different gear manufacturers. And for many reasons, but mostly having to do with budget and schedule, I often am directing and shooting those at the same time. So for example, having a very strong script supervisor or having a very strong producer who's going to be at monitor and might notice that little thing in the background that, I'm too busy talking to the actors or, working with the AC to set up the shot or figure out what lens we're using on this thing. I love it having a team that, that has your back, and Food That Built America has a really strong crew. So I really enjoyed working on that project.
And you also were involved in something that I followed years ago, which is the Digital Bolex. What can you tell me about that? How did that come about? Why did you guys decide to recreate the Bolex in a digital format?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting project. So the genesis was Joe Rubenstein had been working at a photo booth company that he co-founded. And as photo booths became huge for parties and things like that, he wanted to work on a raw shooting camera that could do motion, basically. And it sort of spiraled off from there. And in talking, to a lot of people, he realized that there wasn't anything fulfilling the role that 16 millimeter played in independent film in the digital space. And I met him through mutual acquaintances while he was still in the development process of this. And he, I think, was about 10 years older than me. So he had experienced really his whole career. He was formerly a DP before he went into the photo booth business. His whole career had basically been on 16, and he didn't like digital. And so he sort of hung up the DP hat when digital came in. And I had only really been shooting on digital because I was of the DSLR generation. And so I was weirdly like the target audience of the camera that he was building, but also I had a background in user interface, and I had done a minor at USC in, video game design, and had my first job was online. It was user interface for games in a virtual world. So things like designing manuals and menus and the workflow of how you would interact with, a game or an interface in general was something that I had a big background in. And he originally was bringing me in to direct commercials for it, but it was a little too early in the process to really be able to do that. But as I spoke to him more, I ended up having like pretty significant input on the build and the design of the camera. And so, fast forward 6 months, I'm the CCO of the company. And, I was there working on that project for 5 years, and it was really fulfilling. And we, had some pretty good feathers in our cap. I think I was the first person to do any kind of grant or focus on women cinematographers. It was at a time where that was not a thing that people were really actively talking about. And, I formalized this grant program that would allow women to apply and then get gear that they could use on projects. And some of those projects ended up at really major film festivals. I think, by the time we were done with Bolex, stuff that I had lent projects to ended up at like Sundance, South by, Tribeca, Venice. And then we've now actually had 2 films that were shot on the Digital Bolex that premiered at Cannes. And there was a selection of monochrome shorts that I collaborated on, kind of providing gear for with the National Film Board of Canada, one of which was nominated for a Canadian Oscar in short documentary. So, we had a really great team there, and our engineering team up in Canada, which is where everything was designed, was pretty amazing, and I had a great time working with them. And it's a weird thing because we were such a small company. You don't have product stocked on shelves forever, and there's no supply chain for making camera parts in basically all of North America. It just is not unfortunately, it's like not a manufacturing ecosystem that exists here. And so we basically had to call it at the peak of the popularity of the product, because we couldn't suddenly order thousands of parts at a time, which is what our suppliers wanted us to do. And we were basically given an ultimatum, and, we didn't feel like we could pay people's rents on extra parts if the sales didn't keep up. So we had to make, the adult decision of saying, okay, that's that. But the result of that, which was crazy. I mean, for the next 4 years after we stopped making them, it would be weekly, if not daily, requests from people. How do I buy this camera? The community is still just incredibly strong and supportive. And, we are seeing still really big projects shot on the camera with, actors or actresses that you've heard of. And again, this year was one of the years that there was a feature premiering at Cannes shot on the camera. And it's really nice to be associated with something that has such a legacy, but also is like a tool that artists really respond to. And it continues to fulfill a need within the ecosystem in terms of its, ease of use to create a unique look. I think that because it's fully raw, because it has an internal SSD, there's certainly workflow reasons that differentiate it and maybe make it seem not as easy to use as other cameras. But it was also designed to be kind of an all-in-one package that a lot of people continue to use because they find it very intuitive. And it was a really great thing to to be part of.
Now, I have one last question that I like to ask everyone I interview. We've been in this pandemic for almost 2 years now, or sorry, 18 months to a bit more. And in that time, a lot of people have turned to streaming services for entertainment. Is there a show or a movie you discovered over the past year on a streaming service that you think others should check out?
Well, I'll answer that in two parts. The first part is when 18 and a half shut down, as I mentioned, we were shooting at a hotel in the middle of nowhere in Greenport, Long Island, which is a beautiful, beautiful town. And one of our producers was the owner of the location where we were shooting, and he very graciously invited any of the crew that, you know, was hesitant to go back to New York City in the middle of the pandemic to stay there. So for 2 months, me and 6 other people from the crew actually lived at the hotel, and we did a movie night almost every other night, and we watched over 100 films together. And so it was a really unique experience because I was, you know, getting to rewatch a lot of interesting comfort films. You know, we were watching less, you know, obscure type of films and more, you know, Terminator and True Lies and stuff that we had all seen, but maybe hadn't seen since we were younger in some cases, or hadn't watched it with a group in a long time. So I had this really unique experience of being able to rewatch and discuss these films that I really enjoyed with a group of people that I respect and work with. So that was like a really big plus of my pandemic. But in terms of new things that I hadn't seen anymore, probably the funniest thing was I've been a cord cutter for a long time. So sometimes there are shows that are, you know, popular, or at least popular within my sort of friends group, that I don't get a chance to see until they pop up streaming somewhere. And so I finally, over the pandemic, sat and watched Hannibal, which I thought was great. But it turned out that like all these people that I knew, including some of the people who had been on my crew, are like obsessed with this show. And so suddenly it felt like I was in this like weird new club. And when we went off of 18 and a half to go, because 6 of the 7 of us actually were on Food That Built America, also from that, what we called the quarantine. It turned out like a whole bunch of people on that set were into it too. So it's like a really interesting experience that I maybe hadn't had since I was like, I don't know, in middle school or high school, of like, you know, discovering X-Files for the first time and just seeing that all these people were like, you know, really dedicated fans of something. And I thought that was cool, because the last show that I really got into that was a newer show was Halt and Catch Fire. And I mean, I would tell everybody about it. And I think it's, you know, for me, it's like, you know, one of my top 10 favorite shows of all time. And I think it's really beautiful and unique. And, you know, some of that is just total bias because it's about people developing tech products. And that's something that I identified with and saw myself and saw people I knew in those characters. But I could never get anyone to watch Halt and Catch Fire. So it was cool having watched Hannibal, that it just felt like suddenly I was like in this club of cool kids that like knew what was up.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview. And that's it for this week. Make sure to check out our channel at filmmakeru.com for all our latest courses. And of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I want to thank you again for joining us. And also our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.